I'm Brian Sackett. I'm a member of the Spiritual Awakenings International Board. I'm co-chair of the Spiritual Awakenings Sharing Circles. I happen also to be an affiliated group leader. So the panel today is the Spiritually Transformative Experiences / Consciousness Researchers panel. So it's my pleasure to begin with our first speaker, and that's Monique Rebelle. Monique is an artist, a painter, and a spiritual teacher. She's the author of Transcendence Calling, The Power of Kundalini Rising and Spiritual Enlightenment. And she's a teacher of our Multidimensional Consciousness System. So please join me in welcoming Monique.
Hello, everyone. I am most grateful for this opportunity to present at the Spiritual Awakenings International Conference. Today, I will go over the major points of my Kundalini rising experience and explain how our multidimensional consciousness system became an obvious result of my insights. Thereafter, I will focus on one of the most important, in my opinion, points of transcendence in the Kundalini rising process. So the phenomenon took place after several months of depression. On the day I decided to end my life. I did not know about Kundalini or subtle body. I did not believe in chakras. The beginning stage of finding myself in an emotional vacuum that I called emptiness was unusual, but not yet terrifying. What really scared me was the rainbow tube of light that I saw dancing around me. I wanted to run away, but it was moving with me. I conquered my fear and sat down to see if anything else would happen. In the next stage that took maybe 5 minutes, I observed and relived all of the events of my life that took place over the span of 35 years. That's how old I was when it happened. The thoughts connected with those events traveled up to the present time and vanished like bubbles of oxygen reaching the water surface. I realized that all my problems became resolved and my life was completed. I was elated and light as a feather. I understood this could happen to everyone. My mind, free from any lingering thoughts, was now carefully registering the ongoing process. I was surrounded by milky light and golden speckles falling on me. I felt a beautiful presence coming closer and embracing me. My heart felt a physical touch, and I found myself in eternal, all-pervading love. I understood it is the same love the great spiritual masters have been talking about. In the next stage, heavenly music and blue air were all around me, and figures in robes came to connect and share information. The stage that followed began with a vision and required me asking questions about what was going on. This process continued throughout what I understood as soul self-realization until no more questions could be asked. There was only brightest light and unity with all there is, in full awareness of every moment anew. Being created and being the creator simultaneously. Observing myself after the experience, I realized that all of my emotional problems were gone. I could not find them. Their place was taken by clarity and understanding. Feeling love and compassion for all, I became a deeply happy and inspired person. among many profound insights, I observed that there were 7 specific stages of this incredible beyond life and death experience, and I called them dimensions. I could see through all of them and wrote down their characteristics. I concluded from my research that chakras, known from Hinduism or Jainism, are the gates opening us up to ever-present dimensions of perception, and Kundalini is an individual unit of consciousness. If our Kundalini, resting at the bottom of the spine, uncoils and is able to travel through the chakras all the way up and exit through the crown chakra, we experience the bliss of full consciousness. Before we go any further, I would like to share with you my understanding of these 4 words: brain, mind, ego, and intellect. Brain is an organ in our body, the first dimension. We perceive and experience our body and the world around us through the first chakra, and thus we find ourselves alive in our material world. Mind is the 3rd chakra, opening us up to the 3rd dimension of thoughts and mental structures. These mental structures usually serve as a base for a further study and handling of the material reality. Mind is also able to analyze our emotional world. It operates in a logical and linear way of thinking and concludes by association. Mind is willful and result-oriented. Ego is simply dominance of the first 3 chakras in the subtle body system and a fusion of their energies. It means that we pay most attention to those worlds. While our whole being is magical and incredibly powerful, we tend to live by the limited consciousness of our egos. Intellect. Although in common understanding, intellect is synonymous with mind or means mental capacity, what I consider a pure intellect is a dimension we can access through the 7th chakra. It is the witnessing, observing, contemplating mind that concludes by discernment. By developing our intellect, we can access the sphere of divine wisdom, which can be another term for the 7th dimension. In the present state of humanity, we are predominantly focused on the material, emotional, and mental dimensions. Upper ones may appear as glimpses, although for some of us, they are much more present and meaningful. Each dimension operates on a different principle, and therefore we need to approach each chakra separately. Also, chakras are hierarchical in order, which means that from one chakra, one can perceive below, but not above. The 2nd chakra is usually congested with emotions, and the 3rd one with thoughts and mental structures. We can clear the 2nd and 3rd chakra by training them. One of the main practices that allow for clearing the 2nd chakra is the practice emotions emptiness. In order to allow Kundalini to move up, we need to release the emotions and reach the state of emotional vacuum. There are 7 steps in this practice, and if you're interested, there is a link to it on my homepage, on the homepage of my website. Today, I wanted to give more attention to the 3rd chakra, the gate to the world of thoughts and will, as it is one of the biggest obstacles for Kundalini to break through on its way up. The reason for it is that our mind cannot think outside of itself. it cannot see how it fills itself up with mental baggage. It is conditioned by the state of its material world, by the emotional reactions of the second chakra, and by all the information it collects. Our regular third chakra mind is just a small part of our consciousness. It's limited to its own method of deduction and unable to perceive the content of the upper dimensions. Besides being aware of that truth, we also need to work on clearing our third chakra from lingering mental structures and a multitude of thoughts that block the portal to this dimension of solutions to problems. The action of having Kundalini energy flushing it with regenerative flow of pure consciousness is something we cannot just make happen at will, but we can train our mind to get ready for that miraculous moment using specific practices. Practices for focusing and surrendering the mind. You don't have to have a great mind, but just enough discipline and desire to practice regularly. There are many practices that will help the mind to become stable, to over time narrow the focus to one thought, and then voluntarily surrender that thought. A stable mind with a focus on one thought can arrive at the present time and eagerly solve problems. That state of mind is also ideal for Kundalini to move up, to reach for the information from the upper dimensions. Many of the practices focusing the third chakra mind can be done during various activities and our daily tasks. The choice depends on our personal predispositions and needs. For some, it may be hiking and counting steps. For others, careful observation while executing every stage of preparing a meal. Board games, developing mental strategies like chess, for example, are also great for narrowing the focus and strengthening the mind. For artists, it can be focusing on their art. There are also other important third chakra practices I call know thyself. They have to do with the first stage of the self-inquiry process that begins in the third chakra. About the upper dimensions. We might experience the upper dimensions as sudden psychic insight, revelations, visions, and more. These experiences can be powerful and life-changing. Special talents and access to incredible wealth of knowledge comes from one or more of the upper chakras active in our subtle body system. Here is what we can expect from reaching the upper dimensions. In short, fourth dimension is feeling loved and protected, and loving and protecting with compassion all of the world. Fifth is the magical sphere of connection with other beings, ancestors, spiritual guides, animal spirits, ascended masters. It is the dimension of spiritual healing, psychic powers, Akashic records, and more. Sixth is the dimension of visions and intuitive visual understanding, sacred symbols, archetypes, divination systems, astrology, numerology, God, religions, and more. Seventh is the dimension of the higher mind, observing and discerning philosophical thinking, universal spiritual truths, and divine wisdom. By training the lower chakras and cultivating the upper ones, we help Kundalini in its evolutionary transformation. Each of us can, over time, lifetimes, create a state of being where all of the chakras are open, developed, and ready for a full Kundalini ascension. with the right kind of practice, this desirable phenomenon can be accessible to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. I appreciate the clarity of your presentation and that it's based on both your personal experiences as well as your research. I'd like to introduce next our next speaker, and that's Dr. Danny Geren. Danny is an acupuncturist and an intuition medicine practitioner. He's a teacher of traditional Chinese medicine at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. And he teaches advanced classes in spirit depossession and emotional healing in Sausalito, California, at the Academy of Intuition Medicine. So let's join me, please, in warmly welcoming Danny.
Nice to be here with all of you. I am here to share about my personal journey of starting to work with spirits and helping them to cross over into the light. So as was mentioned, I'm a doctor of acupuncture and Chinese medicine, as well as a practitioner of intuition medicine. I will start by saying that when I first got into really the exploration of spirituality, it really has to do with my mother's mental health. She was somebody who, since I was a very young age, was very mentally ill. She has bipolar disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder that focuses on safety. And so she was always very worried about everything. And on top of that, she has a narcissistic personality disorder. So I was born into this family that had a lot of really intense mental health issues. And through that, through my growing up, I started getting my own depression. And it was around when I was in college that the depression hit really hard. And during that time, I started exploring spirituality. Thankfully, where I went to school at UC Berkeley, they had lots of classes on that. And I started exploring various different traditions. Ultimately, I mostly practice Buddhism and do a lot of meditation retreats and practice that style of Buddhism on top of doing a lot of energy work on myself. So eventually I got to the point that I wanted to practice medicine, and I chose to do Chinese medicine, and I'm so glad that I do. I love doing acupuncture and I love the system. And when I did my doctorate in Chinese medicine, my doctorate focused on emotional and spiritual healing through the acupuncture systems. And so it was a big exploration, a huge paper on that, and I just loved it, and it was really beautiful. Around the same time, I also started going to the Academy of Intuition Medicine, which is in Sausalito, California. And in that time, started developing more skills. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the first depossessions that I did where I helped spirits to cross over into the light, the first one was when I was in college. I was in North Berkeley, California, and where I lived in a Buddhist practice house, and it was the middle of the night, and I went to the kitchen. I was really hungry. I had a voracious appetite at that time in my life, and in the middle of the night, I was hungry. And while I was there in the kitchen, all of a sudden, I started getting glimpses and seeing two Native American spirits. And right there where we were was very sacred ground for the Ohlone Indians. And I started to converse with these spirits or these ghosts, as you can call them. And they showed me their story, showed me what happened to them. I won't necessarily go into all of it, but of course it's some tragic death, and there was a husband and wife, etc. And I have no idea how I knew to do this, but I just knew that I could help them. And so what I did was I called on the divine light to come in and to create a passageway for them. And what they did was they just went into the light. They healed and crossed over into the light, and then they were gone. And interestingly, I was like, oh, well, that was cool. Great. And I just kept going about doing my thing. I didn't think too much about it. And I think it's because it's something that's just innate in me. The second time I had a very, very deep experience working with spirits or ghosts that were passing was around the time of my grandfather's passing. So I was there in the house. It was late at night, and I was meditating, and I could sense two things. I sensed my grandfather's spirit still in the house, and then I also sensed what we could call the angel of death. And thankfully, I didn't have fear at that point, and I was just paying my respects to the angel of death. And what happened was the angel of death acknowledged me and then just came and took my grandfather and helped him to cross over. And it was very beautiful. And there was a very sweet feeling in the house. Everything got light. And I just could tell he was at peace. And so it was a very, very sweet moment. The next time, and this is all without me having formal training and doing any of this work, the next time I was dating a woman and she had a stalker who had been stalking her, and he kept calling and trying to find her and all these things. And she kept telling me, oh, I think he has duppies attached to him, duppies. And I didn't know what that term meant at that time, but it is a Caribbean term for ghosts. If you know the Bob Marley song, Duppy Conqueror, that's where that word duppy comes from, and it has to do with spirits. And I was like, oh, don't worry, I can take care of this for you. And I started just doing work on helping the spirits that were connected to this person to heal and cross over into the light. Now, I was very, I don't know, I don't want to say arrogant, but I didn't go cautiously as I was working with these spirits. And it was much more difficult. A lot more fear came up, and there's a lot more interaction between me and these spirits. And the spirit eventually healed into the light, and it was great. And I was like very happy. And I got slime, so to say. I got very sick. I got sick literally for one day. It felt like I had a really bad flu. And then the flu was gone and I was totally fine. And so it was this, it wasn't really sick, but it was that energetic aspect causing sickness in my body. The beautiful thing is that guy never contacted her or sought her out ever again. So it was those spirits or those duppies that were pushing that forward or causing that behavior. So around the time that I was doing my Chinese medicine postdoctorate training, I also went to the Academy of Intuition Medicine. This is a school in Sausalito, California, founded by Dr. Francesca McCartney in 1984. It's a vocational school for professional intuitives, but also for anybody who's interested in developing intuition medicine as a pragmatic skill, in order to teach them, to empower them, to discover and use their innate natural intuitive sense in everything in their life, so that they can explore life through this intuitive sense and have the skills and the means in order to live spiritual, I don't know if spiritual is the best word there, but definitely a spiritual, but an energetically aware life. And so while I was in that school, I was so fascinated by the topic of entity possession that when we got to that module, I was voracious for the information. I kept asking questions, and the head teacher called me up to sit in front. She said, no, you have to sit in front. And my ego got all, flattered and stuff. But I later realized it was because I was asking so many questions that she wanted me to be close, because it was harder for me or harder to hear me, because I tend to speak very lightly, even though I'm hopefully doing a good job right now. And so I was fascinated by this topic, and through the training, I started seeing the connection of my mother and all of the spirits with her mental health issue, all of the entities that were connected to her, and then began this pathway or this lifelong journey of really healing myself and clearing the spirits from myself that I inherited from my mother, and then also keeping my mother's spirits at bay when I interact with her, because she's still got a lot of those connected to her. So what was beautiful, though, during that time as well, is that I saw the overlap of how I was taught at the Academy of Intuition Medicine and how I was taught with particular acupuncture energetic systems called the external internal dragons. And so these energetic systems in acupuncture are there as a means of helping to kick out energy that isn't ours, that attacks the body. And so with that, I started seeing and mapping out the connections. And for my final project for the school, when I was graduating with my master's certificate in intuition medicine, hopefully that's the precise terminology for that degree, excuse me. But I started seeing that overlap and mapping the system that's taught at the Academy of Intuition Medicine with this system in acupuncture, and did that as my final project for the class. And it was beautiful, and I'm very honored to do this. Now I get to teach advanced classes on this topic in the master's curriculum, the master's certificate curriculum. So it's a wonderful school and a wonderful opportunity to get to help people to develop these skills and to understand this topic. And so just to talk very briefly about the basics of my strategy of working with spirits and helping them to heal into the light, the first thing to notice is the difference between having a lot of fear versus compassion for these spirits. The way that it's shown in media and movies is like, you think of The Exorcist or all sorts of other things where they are these scary things that we should be afraid of. And yes, I understand that sometimes it is scary and sometimes it is a very serious issue. But what I've noticed is that when you come to these spirits from a place of compassion, where you show them love and you show them that you are here for them too, realizing that it's not just the client who's in front of you who needs the healing, but it's also the spirit here that needs this healing. And so what I notice is when I come to it from that place and I show that love, I show that compassion to the entity that's connected there or the ghost that's connected there, what I notice is they completely changed their demeanor. When I used to come in and I'd be like, I'm going to use brute strength, I'm going to make them heal into the light. Whenever I do that, then there is a natural defensiveness that they bring when I'm working with them. Whereas when I switch to that compassion, the beautiful thing is they soften, they become less defensive. And then I'm able to interact with them in this beautiful place of, okay, we're here, we want to heal, because everything here is just wanting to heal. The reason that they're connected to somebody is because usually, it can be other reasons, but usually there is some sort of connection where the person has some sort of emotional pattern that ghost or entity is also trying to heal. And again, there's many other reasons, but it is a very common reason for that to happen. And so when you recognize that and then you bring in divine light, there's a lot of different energies that I work with that are taught at the Academy of Intuition Medicine. When you bring in that divine light as an umbrella term, bring that energy in and offer the spirits whatever it is that they need in order to heal. It really changes their demeanor. They can then accept that energy in. Sometimes I'll ask what it is that they need and they'll tell me, and I ask the divine light to give that to them. But a lot of the times it's just asking the divine light, can you just give them whatever they need? The divine light has that wisdom to come down to give them what they need. And then this very beautiful thing happens where the spirit will heal into the light. It'll cross over and dissolve into the light. And then as it does that, this beautiful thing happens where a piece or a part of the essence of that person who we're working with, the actual client or the patient, and a piece or that essence of their spirit is then released that spirit was holding on to, or excuse me, that entity was holding on to. When it heals into the light, it releases that back to the client. And it's essentially like a type of soul retrieval. You're helping them recover the essence of their spirit back into their body, reclaim their energetic space. And then, of course, I work a lot with helping with their energetic protection systems and their energetic boundaries and their sovereignty for the client in order to help prevent this thing from happening again, this particular issue. So yeah, hope you enjoyed that. This is just a quick overview of some of the work that I do and a little bit of my history with that and my education. So thank you for your time. Great to be here with you.
Thank you, Danny. That was, again, fascinating. It reminds me of Emma Bragdon did a talk earlier today, and the depossession work you're doing is what in the Brazilian Spiritism tradition they call disobsession. So it's very interesting. Thank you.
Wonderful.
So let's introduce our next speaker. This is Mona Sobhani. She's a PhD. She's a cognitive neuroscientist, and she's an author and an entrepreneur. She's a former research scientist at the University of Southern California. She's an author and researcher on psychedelic sciences, altered states of consciousness, and the transpersonal. So again, let's warmly welcome Mona Sobhani. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'm going to tell my story of how I went from being a hard-nosed scientific materialist to an open-minded spiritual seeker. So as mentioned in the introduction, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist by training. I got my PhD from USC. I did a postdoc at Vanderbilt in law and neuroscience. I published papers, did neuroimaging, and then I dabbled in digital health for a while. So I had a pretty traditional academic path. But I was pretty anti-spiritual and anti-religious because I really didn't have a need for it in my life. And I also found that it didn't align with my Western scientific worldview. So in our mainstream culture, but also in our training, we're taught that the universe is created of matter and it's physical and that it's dead. Everything's random and meaningless. And especially in neuroscience, they train us that any meaning that we find in life or in experiences is created from our brain. So our brains take in stimuli, they look for coincidences, they find meaning, and if they're storytellers, they derive stories from the stimuli that come in, and that's how we operate. So that's what I believed because that's what I was trained to believe. And the one asterisk I have to put on that is that I'm Persian, and in our cultural heritage, we have a tradition of divination. And you can use anything like tarot cards or whatnot, but in our family, my grandmother used to use Turkish Armenian coffee, which is this like thicker coffee that you leave the grinds in the cup and they form images. And then if you're lucky enough to have someone who's intuitive, they can peer into it, catch pictures and intuit something about your past, present, and future. So my grandmother was really good at reading and my mother is really good at reading. And so people would always fight over readings from her. And I never believed in it or paid attention to it. You know, it was like always in the background of our family gatherings. But in graduate school, she started reading for me. And I would just take notes, you know, politely. I didn't really take it seriously. But over time, I noticed that she was more right than she was wrong. So if she warned me, you know, pay attention, don't lose money, make sure you pay all your bills or something like that, I would take it seriously. And although I couldn't explain it with my science, I knew that it worked. And so I just lived in cognitive dissonance. Like I didn't bother to try to explain it and I just kind of moved on. But then I had a point in life where I was kind of in this existential crisis. I think it hit me earlier than a lot of people, but I started feeling like, is this it? We wake up every day, we go to work, and then we suffer, and then we die. And so in the middle of that, then I had two emotional life events that my mom predicted with the coffee that kind of threw me into further crisis. So I think the reason was because these were way more emotional than things in the past. So one was a death. And so 6 weeks in advance, every week, my mom started acting weird and saying, I feel like I have to warn you, you're going to get bad news. And it turned out to be one of our professors at USC was killed by one of the students. And it was someone I had worked with on my dissertation project. So the event was upsetting, but the fact that death, like that kind of information could go through time and come through coffee grinds really threw me for a loop. It really upset my, kind of forced my two worlds to collide and threw me into crisis. And the second event, I didn't do anything at that point, but a few years later, the second event was a relationship that ended. And that was it. Like that was the final leg of the stool that was knocked out. And then for the first time, this was my dark night of the soul. Like I felt despair for the first time and hope, and I lost optimism. And I just, it was a rough time. So in the darkness, mostly because I felt like I didn't understand the universe. I didn't understand science anymore. I didn't understand the readings. Couldn't make sense of anything. And I just kept thinking, what is the point of all of this? So I'm from Los Angeles, and my girlfriends would go to psychics and intuitives all the time. And I never went with them because I thought it was stupid. But then they invited me during this dark point in my life. And I like to joke now that nobody goes to the science section of a bookstore when they're having a personal crisis, right? You don't go to find a science textbook. That's when you're broken open to look for the other beautiful things in life. So I was like, whatever, let's go, I'll try it. And they were really eerily accurate. And my friends and I would go, we repeated this over a year. We would go to the same reader, we'd swap readers, we'd go to different readers, we'd swap readings. And I was like, if they say the readings are generic and vague, we should be able to swap them and they should be true for each of us. but they weren't. They were specific to each of, to each of us, to each of the events in our lives and the periods in our lives that we were in, and on multiple variables, and I think like a scientist, I'm like, what are the odds that they would get 10 variables, right? Like that's outrageous. And so in the readings, they would also discuss reincarnation and past lives, things that I was not at all familiar with, so it went right over my head. But it did make me curious, but I didn't explore it further. I just kind of thought, that's weird. Okay, but I was still in crisis. So then I was not listening to anything spiritual, but I was listening to Chelsea Handler's podcast. She's a comedian in the US, and she had a psychic medium on, Laura Lynn Jackson. And the two of them started talking about this book, Many Lives, Many Masters, written by a psychiatrist, and this really interesting case study. And they're like, everyone has to read this book. So I ordered it, not knowing what the book was about, really. I just thought, case study, psychiatrist sounds good. So I get it, I read it, and it's about past life regression. And so it throws me for a loop because I'm like, what am I reading? This is the weirdest book I've ever read. He was Yale and Columbia educated, was a skeptic, he was an atheist, but he stumbles across his patient telling him past life stories, and it starts to heal her. And as a neuroscientist, I was really interested in that because behavioral health is such a difficult topic in the US, or actually everywhere. And anyway, it caught my attention. And then in the book, he also talks about spirits, and he describes the same spiritual framework that I had heard from the intuitives. So this really got me. This was it. This was like kicked off the journey. I'm like, this is too much. There's too many signs. Keeps coming up. I have to explore. I have to look into this. So I launched a personal project, probably also just to distract myself from my suffering. I would deal with that later. But I launched a personal project to dive into all of this. So I read the entire literature on past life regression, which led to the reincarnation literature, near-death experiences, psychic phenomena. And then I decided to speak to people. So I started interviewing intuitives and mystics because I wanted to understand their personal experiences. And then I also spoke to my scientist colleagues because I realized I don't know if any of them are spiritual or religious, or if they've ever had experiences that they couldn't explain with science. I kind of just wanted a sanity check, like, am I nuts? And so I interviewed them, and they were all way more open-minded than I thought they would be. So, and everybody had an experience to share. So this project, one of the biggest things that I found was there was a lot of actually scientific evidence for intuitive or psychic phenomena. And obviously I can't go through all of it today, but this was one of the moments, or one of the things that really shook me. So that's why I'm bringing it up. But I found that this psi research, as they call it, had been conducted for over a century by hundreds of scientists and labs across the entire world at really prestigious places like Princeton, Cornell, Duke, UCLA. And there was so much research that there were reviews and meta-analyses, which is what we look to in science to look at the summary of a field. And so I was impressed. I mean, and the experimental designs were comparable to what we use in neuroscience and psychology. So if the topic hadn't been so unconventional, it would have just been a normal, review paper that you read and you wouldn't think twice about it. But because it's unconventional, it gets a lot of scrutiny. But I read through everything really carefully, and I was like convinced. I thought if it was a normal science topic, we wouldn't even think twice about it. The past life regression also really, as I mentioned, the Many Lives, Many Masters that got me interested in all of this. What I found fascinating was that a lot of these behavioral health practitioners would stumble across this method and then use it and find how useful it was in their patients, and then find all these, crazy synchronicities, or two people telling the same story who don't know each other. And that they would all report the same spiritual framework, which I thought was really fascinating, since many of them were patients from the West who, reincarnation. So that stuff's not really the mainstream religion in Western culture. So I thought that as a phenomenon was really strange. And I honestly couldn't believe anyone hadn't looked into it further. And this just, I'm going to skip it, but I went into reading, research on near-death experiences and all that. So anyway, this led to round 2, my second crisis, which was my identity crisis. So once I opened my mind, I kind of thought, I'm going to suspend my beliefs. I'm going to get curious and read and open my mind. Then my identity and ego started to have a panic attack. And I was, I'd look at myself and be like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm the kind of person surrounded by these books with words like reincarnation, psychic phenomena, and, all that judgmental stuff that I've been carrying around for so long came out. But I also wanted to think really deeply, like, why was I in crisis? And one of the things culturally is that Western culture tells us believing in impossible things is crazy, stupid, and delusional. But we're also told that you can't ignore scientific evidence. So one of my problems was that the scientific evidence I was looking at was pointing to the fact that impossible things were true. So I was just caught in this mental loop of I didn't know what to do. So I thought, I'm going to take a step back as a neuroscientist. Do we even have a full model of the brain? And we don't. So, I mean, we already have so many holes in our models. You know, there's cases like savants, people who are born with skill sets and knowledge they couldn't have reasonably acquired in this lifetime. People have brain injuries and suddenly can speak a foreign language or have photographic memory. We don't have explanations for that in neuroscience besides saying it's neuroplasticity, which doesn't explain anything. And of course, we have no explanation for consciousness and we don't have models for these things. So I thought, well, neuroscience is already incomplete. You know, who's to say? So scientific materialism and the Western worldview don't account for many of these experiences. We just ignore them as outlying data points. We just kind of ignore them. We can't fit them in a model, so we ignore them. But I found that in my research and project that almost everybody had a story. So these are really typical human experiences that we've just come to ignore in our society, which is really strange. But as I read about the history of many cultures, I found that believing that we're interwoven with the cosmos and there's no distinction between mind and matter and you and me and all that, it's actually been the foundation of reality longer than it hasn't. And so that gave me context to realize Western cultures, even though we act like it's the best and final word, it's really not. And that these issues are not finalized. These debates are going on in philosophy and physics to today. So I think of our worldviews as limited data sets now, and I call myself the old me. I had locked my data set and I was like, no more evidence. I have my worldview. This is it. But of course, now I've come to see I never want to lock my worldview. I never want to lock the data set anymore. And I've come to embrace both objective scientific and personal proof because along the way, I had a lot of my own experiences like precognitive dreams and things started to open up. And actually, I had a lot of those experiences when I was young, but they stopped after my science training and then they started coming back. So anyway, my personal mantra became stay radically curious. And I wrote up all my experiences in a book called Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, which you can find all that information on my website. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mona. Thanks for, again, a fascinating and very clearly spoken presentation. So we'll move to our last panelist, and this is David Gerrelli. And David is the author of How to Escape from Hell, Studies and Interpretations of the Afterlife. He's the winner of Australian Award for Digital Innovation, and David is the Global Director of Technology. He's a researcher and expert into the darker aspects of near-death experiences. So let's join me, please, in warmly welcoming David.
Thank you, Brian, for that kind introduction. It's good to be among everyone here. Some really interesting presentations today, so I'm very happy to be here. So I'm going to talk about near-death experiences, but I'm going to specifically focus on distressing near-death experiences. And to put that in context, it's estimated that 16.5 million Americans will have a near-death experience. So my research, as I mentioned, focuses specifically on distressing, hellish, or negative near-death experiences, which affects around 1.6 million Americans every year, which is around 4 to 12% of all near-death experiences. So to put it in context, in 2022, there were 3.6 million births in the United States. So the number of people that experience near-death experiences is very, very high indeed. So my background is in data science. I spent 3 years researching thousands of near-death experiences from the Near-Death Research Foundation and the International Association for Near-Death Experiences. I used a combination of statistical, comparative, and interpretational analysis to look into the results, which I'm going to share with you today. So before we get into the specifics of distress and near-death experiences, there's some important concepts that we need to familiarize ourselves with. One of those is the law of attraction. The law of attraction basically states that like energy is attracted to like energy. So for example, negative emotions are attracted to negative energy, and positive is attracted to positive. So for example, emotions such as hate and shame are attracted to other negative energies such as guilt and contempt. So when we're born into this world with no negative energy whatsoever. Children only know love when they're born, so they do not possess any of that negative energy. They collect this negative energy as we move through our lives. So all of the pain and suffering that we go through, all of the hate and contempt, these are the things that we pick up throughout our lives. And this is what contributes to our negative energy. So when our time finally comes and we can no longer inhabit our bodies, our consciousness or our soul moves on to the afterlife. And in heaven, there is no shame, no hate, no guilt. There is only love. And it's a kind of love that is stronger than the love that we experience on earth. And this is very typical of experiences where people have positive near-death experiences. They mention that the love that they experience is stronger than that of the love a mother has for a child or a husband has for a wife, for example. And I refer to this kind of love as agape, which means the love that God has for man and the love that man has for God. So it's a kind of love that is so strong that when people come back from positive NDEs, they many a time struggle to reintegrate themselves back into their lives because they can no longer experience that kind of love. So the negative energy that we carry throughout our lives, when we finally come to the point of passing on to the afterlife, we come to a point where we have this experience called a life review. And the purpose of the life review is to go through everything that's happened in our lives, both positive and negative, and to learn from that experience. And so it's not a process of judgment. This entire process is meant to enable us to process some of those negative experiences and negative things that happen throughout our lives. And because we're human and we're fallible and we make mistakes, sometimes we choose hate over compassion and contempt over understanding and love. And so the process of going through our life review is intended to help us to shed some of that negative energy. So heaven, for example, has been mentioned various times through various presentations, is a place of pure love or agape. And you can imagine that in such a situation that we cannot take that negativity and that kind of pain and suffering and guilt and shame specifically. These are some of the kind of key emotions that we carry over when we go to the afterlife. And during that process, it's very common for us to meet beings of light or entities that put out this very strong kind of love or this very strong kind of agape. And for many people, they find it very difficult to accept that they are worthy of that love or worthy of that light. And this is a human condition. This is something that we understand from the lives we live on earth. But the purpose of our lives on earth is to learn from these mistakes, is to learn from the pain and suffering that we experience and to choose the more positive outcomes from those negative experiences. So to choose love over judgment, for example. So it's very important as we go through our lives that we understand that we are fallible and we are human, and not to hold on to that pain and that guilt and that shame, and just to learn from it and move on. And this is part of our kind of eternal growth. So for example, if we're to think about why are we here on earth, and this is obviously, the meaning of life is a huge question. And from my research, the reason that we're here is really just, if you think of earth as a huge academy, if you think about heaven, in heaven, you can't experience pain, you can't experience suffering. And it's not about the pain or the suffering, it's about how you overcome that. It's about how you support the people around you and how you choose, for example, hope over fear. There is no courage without fear. And so there are things that we can never learn in heaven that we can learn here on earth. And I use the word heaven. There are many words for this. So I'm using the word heaven because people here are most familiar with that, but it could be any interpretation of heaven. So nirvana, Valhalla, whatever you want to call it. But it's the place that we came from, and it's a place where we belong. So coming back to a situation where, as human beings, we've collected all this negative energy throughout our lives, we cannot take that with us into heaven. And if we cannot complete that through our life review, and not everybody has a life review, most people do. People that have distressing near-death experiences, it's not uncommon for them not to have a life review, which I'll come to in a second. But that life review is completely non-judgmental. And typically near-death experiences report that they're surrounded by beings of love and compassion. And as they go through this experience, these beings are encouraging them to learn from these experiences. And the interesting thing about a life review is as you go through it, the way that you impacted others in your life. So for example, if you were in a situation where you made someone feel pain or suffering or contempt, then you will feel what they feel. You will literally be inside of that person during that experience, and you will see every single thing that they've gone through. And it would be natural to think, oh, that's a great kind of judgment, right? That when somebody hurts you, when you go through a life review, they're going to experience what you experience. But that is not the intent of the life review. We all have done things in our life that we may be shameful or guilty about, but that is not the purpose of the life review. It's simply for you to learn from your life the lessons that you cannot learn in heaven and to enrich your soul or your consciousness or whatever you want to call it. That is the point of the life review. So for those of us that come to this point in our afterlife experience, and it is a small percentage, it's 4 to 12%, but it does happen and it comes up a lot. What happens is if they cannot go to heaven because they're filled with all this negativity, then where else would they go? So there's this very ancient concept of an egregore. And an egregore, in essence, is the collective thought form of human emotion, of human energy, right? So heaven, if you think of it as the positive, and heaven's not an egregore, heaven's an actual place. But hell, for example, it's not surprising that in hell, when people talk about their experiences in distressing near-death experiences, they're able to very easily articulate what they saw and what happened to them. Whereas when they talk about heaven, it's beyond human comprehension. They can't talk about the light, the energy, the feeling of love, the feeling of oneness. They really struggle to explain these concepts in heaven. But when it comes to hell, it's exactly what you would expect it to be. In many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, it's what you expect. So death, the burning of, the smell of sulfur, screaming, chaos, pain, torment, all of these things that humans have written about hell for millennia exist in hell. And this is the concept of an egregore. It's the human energy, it's that negative energy that humans have collected, and then we collectively put into this place called hell, which becomes this egregore. And every person that contributes to it sustains it. And so that is the concept of an egregore. And the thing about human beings is our souls are inexplicably powerful. So our souls are incredibly powerful, and they have the ability to manifest. I don't have time to go into the details, but suffice to say, our souls are incredibly powerful. And therefore, we have the ability to create. And the egregore is a result of that creation, the result of that ability to create all that negativity and pain. Again, you can't take it to heaven. It would be like an oil spill in the most beautiful, pristine ocean. Heaven is a place of oneness, of love, of acceptance, of non-judgment. But as human beings, we've collected all of this pain and suffering, and typically guilt and shame, which is really important to remember. We have all this guilt and shame, and we cannot take that with us into heaven or into the light, or whatever term we want to use to describe that place. So we have this thing called our hell, and there is a concept that I refer to as observers. And among thousands of records of near-death experiences, observers are people that have a positive near-death experience, and it's a small number, but they also observe something about hell. So they are shown hell, or this place of chaos and pain. And these observers provide insights that we would never get from people that had a distressing near-death experience. And the reason for that is because people that have positive experiences, they have this all-knowing, all right? So as soon as you pass over to the other side, and typically if it's positive, not negative, then you immediately start to understand things about the universe. You have this collective knowledge of everything in the universe, which you didn't have before. And so these observers give us really interesting insights into what's happening in hell. And one of the things that many of these observers said was that people in hell chose to be there, which for me, when I was doing the research, was, well, why would anyone choose to be in hell? Well, what's up with that? Why would you choose to be in hell? And so coming back to that negative energy, so while we consciously never choose to be in hell, no one would logically make that decision to be in hell, they carry that negative energy. And because of the guilt and the shame that they carry, they feel as though they do not deserve the light for whatever reason. And therefore, effectively, they're turning away from the light. And because of the free will, because of the ability, the power of creation, the power of the soul, we have to take that negativity somewhere. We can't go to heaven. So where else is there to go? And so we are literally weighed down by these negative emotions. And the way to think of this energy, this law of attraction, is kind of like the Force in Star Wars, right? It's a very powerful, everything's connected by agape, by this love. And negative energy is still energy, whether it's positive or negative, it's still energy, it has power. And so it goes into this egregore, we turn away from the light, we don't believe we deserve it, and therefore we go to hell. And in this case, I call it I judge. And so because of free will, God can't just reach in, let's say God or divine being, or again, it's not religious, whatever term you want to use, God can't just reach in and pull you out of hell, because you have free will. You have the power of your soul, and therefore you need to make the conscious decision. You need to understand that you deserve the light. You need to understand that you're human, you are fallible, and you are meant to make mistakes through life. You are meant to experience pain and suffering to learn from it, not because of pain and suffering, but because you are meant to learn from that pain or suffering to enrich your soul. And I won't get into reincarnation, it came up a little bit, but you imagine going through this process many hundreds or thousands of times throughout your life, then your soul becomes enriched gradually and iteratively, time after time. And so therefore, what we find is that when we move into this situation at the end of our lives, and I mean, doctrine and religion teaches us that we are going to be judged, and if we did something bad, then we're going to go to hell. Forget all of that. That's not going to happen. You just need to remember that you are fallible, you are human, you are meant to make mistakes. And no matter, and one of my favorite sayings is, there is nothing that you can do that will make God love you less. And I truly believe that. And I think that from my research, and there is a limited data set for these hellish experiences, but there's enough to come to these conclusions, is that we just need to let it go. We just need to learn from any mistakes that we make. And I say mistakes, they're not necessarily mistakes if you're learning something. Just learn from it, move on, and forgive yourself. And if you do find yourself, and this is very typical for the people that were recovered from these situations in hell, which I include in my book, they call for a savior. And all they're doing by calling for a savior, it's not religious practice. They're just saying, they're turning to the light. They're allowing themselves to be accessible by other beings that are outside of this hellish landscape. And so my final message to you, and it's got my favorite phrase here, is don't be afraid to be human. Go through your lives. You've made mistakes. I mean, you can learn from it now. You don't have to wait until the life review. It sounds like a very clinical term, the life review, but it's a very important concept. And there's lots of information out there on the life review. It's very common with near-death experiences amongst those 16.5 million people. But most importantly, just remember, you're only human. You're supposed to mess up. You're supposed to make mistakes. Don't hold the shame. Don't hold the guilt. Let it go. And heaven is our home. It's where we came from. It's where we belong. And you absolutely deserve it. And so that would be my final message to you. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, David, for a fascinating presentation. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions about this. So let's get to the questions. If you have questions that you haven't asked yet, please type them into the chat. And we'll start. There's a comment from Gail for Mona, I believe. He says, "So sorry from your loss during studying." I think that my question that goes along with that for you would be, how did that affect you? And did it change any of your direction of your research?
Well, I had graduated already. It was just a few years after I graduated. So no, it didn't. It was just very shocking and really shocking, actually. I feel like I'm still processing it because it was it's so unusual. I mean, I guess these kinds of horrible events are unfortunately more and more common in the US anyway, in schools. But yeah, it was just very shocking. Also because he was the kindest person. Like if we had to vote, I actually think he won like best professor or something. He was like the kindest. So but the spiritual stuff that I got into after helped me with that. Helped me, kind of realize it's not over and he's not gone. It's just it's another level. So I think that provided a lot of comfort. That's something I forgot to mention, that the spirituality for me ended up being very valuable. Like I finally found the value in it, and it opened my heart, and it just made living a lot easier. So that was one of the ways.
Thank you. Monique, the question for you is, could you give a couple of specific examples of techniques that you would teach to help unblock the Kundalini rising?
Okay. The way I look at the matter of Kundalini rising is that we should look at state of the chakras. And usually, for most of us, for pretty much everyone, the blockage is in the emotional chakra. I see this as emotional, although there is information from Hinduism that this chakra is sexual, creative, and emotional, but I see it only as emotional accordingly to my experience. And it's the spirit itself, Kundalini. Once Kundalini is spirit in the body, it becomes survival, sexual, and creative. So we need to leave Kundalini alone, because trying to trigger it without having these, especially the second and third chakra congestion removed, it's a very bad idea. So this can cause a lot of problems, and that's why Kundalini is such a subject where people are afraid of it, and there is a reason for it. I teach a 7-step practice how to clear the second chakra, and I offered some practices on the third chakra, how to clear that. And I'm not saying it's easy, but for some of us it's easier. And in my experience, it was a matter of narrowing the focus and focusing on one thought, which is not something that's easy, but I didn't even know I could do it. And then releasing, surrendering. So there are two steps in that practice, focusing and surrendering, but there is much more to it also. We need to know ourselves. So know thyself is another series of different practices that are about finding out about ourselves, what our mind thinks about us. And then the upper ones, usually the cases with those that some of us have them open and developed, but for a lot of people they're not developed, and sometimes they're also congested, the upper ones. I'm not sure if did I answer the question.
Good. Yeah, no, thanks very much, Monique. That's great. Thank you. Here's a question from Marianne for Daniel Geren. Daniel Geren, how would you go about investigating if spirit possession might be a factor in a person who would not be open to considering that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that I tend not to go down that route if they're not really interested in going down there. And so, in my work that I do when I'm doing acupuncture, for instance, or if I'm just doing pure energy work and I'm exploring something with someone and they're open to that, there's a gauging of how ready they are to talk about this subject. And so often I'm talking directly to their spirit, their higher self, asking them if they're ready for it. And if I get a yes, and then I'll broach that subject. But if they're not coming to me, it can be very scary for people to hear about this issue. And so I tread very lightly.
Great. Thank you, Danny. Ellen wants to know, and I think this is a question that any of the panelists could dive in on if they'd like. He says, what if someone commits suicide in anger? They were not premeditating the suicide. He said, is there life review, and do they really shed the negative emotions? My sister did this and I was possessed by her for about 5 years. So maybe we can start with David, because that's kind of directly some of what.
Yeah, for sure. So statistically, there's no correlation between suicide and distress near-death experiences. Around about the same amount of people that have positive experiences, around 50% of people that commit suicide. So because somebody, I mean, that's a very human, it's very based in religion and doctrine, that if we commit suicide, that we're evil or it's a sin or you're guaranteed to go to hell, for example. But statistically, there's no evidence to support that. So if you know somebody who committed suicide, absolutely, there's no reason that they would statistically be in hell.
Yeah.
For example,
Okay.
so there's just no correlation to support that.
Any of the other panelists want to dive in on that one?
If I could hear the question again, please, maybe. I think I missed it.
The question was, what if someone commits suicide? Is there a right of view, and can they really shed the negative emotions?
I think that because a soul is eternal, soul creates our lifetime, is our master. So the soul created that situation where we commit suicide, and in the next lifetime or some other future lifetimes, we will have to resolve it somehow. That's my view on it.
Yeah, and actually, Monique, that's a good point. I've actually come across that before. So there's been a number of near-death experiences where somebody that committed suicide, for example, the lessons that they came to Earth to learn, and the idea is that these lessons that we learn are in some way predetermined before we come to our lives on Earth, that if you commit suicide and kind of cut your life short, you didn't have the opportunity to experience those lessons, to learn those kind of spiritual lessons that you're intended to learn. And therefore, you may have to go back in another life, and I'm going down a rabbit hole a little bit here, but you may have to go back in another life and relive those experiences in a different life, a different person, different personality. But equally, at the same time, it could be that suicide was one of the lessons that you were meant to learn, right? Do I choose death over continued suffering? That could well have been the spiritual lesson you were meant to learn as well. So it really depends on the individual.
Okay. This is another question for you, David. Sean wants to know, in your research, have you found people who have a white light or mystical NDE, and then later in life have a second NDE that turns out to be a distressing NDE?
Oh yeah, all the time. So it's that we have a distressing near-death experience support group with the International Association for Near-Death Experiences, where we kind of counsel people that have had distressing experiences. And actually, most of the people on that, most people that attend that for support have had mostly positive, but one or more negative experiences as well. So it's not uncommon. It does happen. So yeah, for sure, it's something that we do see quite frequently.
Okay, I think there's Just to Be Aloha is the name, but it's a question that Yanni already answered, which is, coming across clients that realize they have attachments, but sometimes do not want to get rid of these attachments. I'd ask my team for guidance on how to proceed. What are the steps you take in this kind of situation?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So a couple of things that I would say is that, one, you have to respect the sovereignty of the person that you're working with, and it's really their choice. And so I never force anything when somebody's not ready for that or not asking for that. And there's a saying in Chinese medicine, you only take someone where they're ready to go to, where they're ready to heal. And so that's one of the things that I would say. Now, there's another situation that I came across, and the founder of the Academy of Intuition Medicine and I, Francesca McCartney, we were discussing it, and she guided me because I was a little unsure how to proceed. But it was a client of mine's husband who had a horrible accident where he had a massive concussion, hit by a car, and was never the same. And so he was in a coma for a long time. And he had what's called a walk-in, where an entity had gone in and essentially kicked his spirit out so much that he was no longer there or barely there, and this other entity was the one that was in control. Now, in that case, because there's no way for that patient to be able to give their permission for that, I asked the wife, my client, my original client, if I have her permission. And then I go and I ask his spirit's permission. And if I have his spirit's permission, then I do the work, which was the case, and was able to clear that entity that had taken over completely. So that's one exception.
Great, thank you, Danny. Mona, what would you say are the top couple of things that you've learned from your research? If you could sum those up, please.
That privacy is not a thing. No, just kidding. I used to be so focused on data privacy in my old job that it was funny coming over to the spiritual side and, and realizing that nothing's really private. Top things. I mean, I think, yeah, that we're all not just people, but that we're so much more connected to our environments and to each other than we believe, and that that our energy affects, like as everyone was talking about, not only affects yourself and your perceptions and your physiology and your emotions, but it affects everyone around you and everything around you. So that was one of the very first things that I started to integrate consciously as I was reading this research. I was just suddenly very aware of my thoughts and my emotions. And that's one of the drives for starting to actually implement spiritual practices into my life. So I had already been meditating, but I started meditating more seriously. I started trying different methods. I started listening to Ram Dass all the time. And just incorporating different ways, and also emotional healing techniques. So like I tried past life regression, I tried EFT, I tried psychedelics, so that's how I got into them. It was for all of this to just try different modalities of trying to understand why I feel the way I do. And the impetus for that was so that I'm not like exuding negative energy or like affecting other people in a negative way. So that idea of really taking care of yourself to take care of everyone else became one of the biggest lessons for me. And I really I mean, I'm still after it. I'm sure I will be for a long time, but that was one of the biggest things. And also that I mean, I think in the beginning I was like, when I need scientific papers, I need to know the mechanism, I need to know, what are the physics, what's the chemistry. And I think after maybe about a year or so, I think my thinking started to change. And the way that you think, like they train you in a specific way of how to think when you're getting a science PhD. And that started to change, where that just became less important, because I started to see that it's like it's alive. It's like the universe is alive. There's an intelligence, and you cannot measure and capture intelligence with our scientific method that easily. So I started to change the way I think about it, and it just became less important. And my hat's off to people who do Psi research and who continuously try, because we should keep trying to find methods to prove it and measure it. But to me personally, it just became less important, because I think it's a different thing. If that makes sense.
Great. Yeah, it does. Thanks very much. Sha'ala has a question for you, David Gerrelli. He wants to know what evidence supports your finding that newborns have no negative energy.
Oh, I didn't do any extensive research into newborns and negative energy. I think generally, I mean, that's more of a assumption based on the fact that children tend to smile a lot, right? If you look at, for example, things like division, right? Political, racial, whatever it may be, these are things that are taught to us. I don't think that's a scientific mystery. I've got children. So when you spend time with children, and particularly when they're born, so there's no scientific evidence to back that up. It's not something I investigate heavily. I think I just use that as an example. Hate and these kinds of things, and division, and these things are taught to us, from our parents or institutions or cultures that we live in. They're not really things I think that we're born with, right? If you think about a child's mental development, they're very instinctive initially at birth. And having children of my own, all I ever saw was love. I don't think any child not just my own children, but any child I've ever been around has ever showed any kind of contempt or shame or guilt. I mean, what reason would there be for that, for them to have those kind of feelings? So no, it's not a scientific conclusion. I think I just use that as an example. But either way, I think it rings true that regardless of, when we come into this world, I think the best way to connect it, if you imagine this, again, it's going down a rabbit hole a little bit, that when you come to Earth, how do you come to Earth? So you come to Earth for a physical being, through a human body, right? So if assuming that you come to Earth as a soul and you come from heaven, a place where there's no negativity, then you can conclude that when you enter the body of that baby or embryo or whatever stage it happens to be at, that because you came from heaven, because you came from home, that there's no negativity. So it's more around that whole concept as opposed to any kind of distinctive evidence to support the children on carrying any kind of negative energy. But I think it's fair to assume they're not.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I think it's from Suzanne for David again. Is grief a negative energy?
I think when it comes to negative energy, it's pretty like, what is negative, right? If you feel pain, shame, guilt, anytime you hurt someone or you're hurt, that's negative. It's really that simple. I wouldn't overanalyze it, overthink about it. I mean, grief specifically is a form of compassion, right? If you're grieving, then it's because you're compassionate or you feel pain for somebody else. The sheer fact you're thinking about someone other than yourself would indicate it's not negative. So when you go through your life and you think about negative and positive, just think of it as a human being. If I'm horrible to someone, if I choose contempt or hate, judgment, which is a real big deal right now, division, all these things are negative, right? That don't bring unity and happiness and love. If something makes you unhappy, it's negative. If something makes you happy, it's positive. That's how I would look at it.
Thank you very much, David. I think, so that's our final question for tonight. I want to thank all the panelists for all the heart and soul in their presentations and great information that we've learned from your presentations. Thank you all for your questions and your participation and attention.